study number 2, and just remember from last night, if you were here, we saw a dramatic change in Levi, didn't we? That was on a scale that's not seen too many times in the scriptures. He went from the zealous, vengeful, self-willed man, okay, to the zealous, spiritual, God-centered tribe. And not in a great space of time. And we were sort of trying to work out where that change might have taken place. It's in between the lines. Left it to you, really, to see if you could find it. But I do want you to notice that in both cases, the zeal didn't change. It was there in Genesis 34, and it was there in Exodus 32, when Moses said, "Who is on Yahweh's side?" But it's the direction of the zeal that changed. It vastly changed. It was a 180-degree change. And in both accounts, Genesis 34, Exodus 32, Levi has a sword. But they're used with totally different motives in those two stories. No longer is it used to defend human honor and human pride. It's now used to defend the holiness of Yahweh. So, being a Levite, brothers and sisters, is not about laying down your sword, but rather knowing when and where to use it. And that's what we want to explore in this study. So we've entitled it Soldiers and Gatekeepers. The correct use of the sword, when and how to fight. Now, we want to begin today's study in Numbers, because the story of the Levites, unfolds in more detail in the book of Numbers. If you thought they were mentioned in the book of Leviticus, because that's where their name's from, you'd be struggling to find much references to the Levites in Leviticus. Don't know quite how that happened. No, the Levite story begins in Numbers. So come to Numbers chapter 1 and the numbering of Israel. So in Numbers 1, we have the numbering of Israel. Now, who was included in the numbering of Israel? We'll have a look at verse 3. From 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel, thou and Aaron shall number them by their armies. So only males and only those over 20. Aaron and Moses were to number them. Now, just notice this word war in verse 3. It's the same word as armies in verse 3. It's the Hebrew word zebah. It means a mass of persons organized for war. And it's used extensively in chapter 1. And it's translated invariably as war 14 times, army 7 times, host 1 time. That's over in verse 52. So it's clear, I think, what the purpose of the numbering was for. This is describing the army. Have a look at verse 45 and verse 46. So were all those that were numbered of the children of Israel by the house of their fathers from 20 years old and upward, and all that were able to go forth to war in Israel, even all they were numbered were 600,000, 3,550. In the army, these were all its soldiers. They had to be 20 years old or older and a male. This is the army. Now, what was the army for? Well, if you're marching through a desert with plenty of water because the rock followed them and the water followed them, you're bound to attract enemies. Just think of Exodus 17 and the Amalekites. And of course, we don't have any record of the wilderness wanderings as such, but we know that at the end, there's Sihon and Og. Okay, so you need an army. Now, in chapter 2, we have the arrangement of the camp. And with the introduction of the tabernacle, this would now have them all camped centered around its 4 sides. The tabernacle was in the middle. And each had to camp. You notice in verse 2 of chapter 2, every man of the children of Israel shall pitch by his own standard. Every man, every camp had to pitch their camp next to their own standard. And you'll notice the continuation of this word, which we already came across in chapter 1, this Hebrew word zibar. You'll see it there in verse 3 and verse 4. And on the east side, toward the rising of the sun, shall they of the standard of the camp of Judah pitched throughout their armies. And Nashon, the son of Amminadab, shall be captain of the children of Israel, and his host, and those that were numbered of them, were 314,600. So in this chapter, we come across this same word, the word hosts, the word armies, 13 times for hosts, and 7 times for armies. But what's a standard? Okay, they had to pitch by their own standard. What does that mean? Well, the Hebrew word for standard is the Hebrew word degel, and it means a big flag or banner. And Phineas says it really was a large military banner. That's the description of this word. So what you get in chapter 2, brothers and sisters, is that this arrangement has all the hallmarks of a military-style camp. That's chapter 1, chapter 2. The soldiers and the camp. A military-style camp. But where do the Levites fit in? Because they're not included in the numbering. Just come back to chapter 1, verse 47. But the Levites, after the tribe of their fathers, were not numbered among them. Well, imagine if you were a young man and you reached the age of 20, how disappointed you could have been, probably were, to see all the other young men enter into the army, but you couldn't. You weren't allowed to defend your family. Because on the surface, it seems that they're excluded from the army, doesn't it? That their chores in the tabernacle are more like servants than soldiers. But that's not the case at all, brothers and sisters. That's not the case at all. Come to chapter 4 of Numbers. Because in Numbers 4, we have the numbering of the Levites. And we notice in verse 2 and 3, take the sum of the sons of Kohath from among the sons of Levi after their families by the house of their fathers. Okay, so here's the first family of the Levites. From 30 years old and upward, even until 50 years old, all that enter into the host. Oh, that's interesting. This is our word, zibar. It's the same word as chapter 1 and chapter 2. They were to enter into the army. That's what the word means. To do the work in the tabernacle of the congregation. You'll notice in verse 22 and verse 23, this is the next family, Gershon. Verse 23, from 30 years old and upward unto 50 years old, thou shalt number them, all that enter in to perform the service. And if you've got a marginal rendition there, you'll see that the literal means to war the warfare. Okay, fighting the fight, battling the battle. This is the Levites. And then in verse 29 and 30, you have the third family of the Levites, the Merarites. You'll notice in verse 30, from 30 years old and upward, even unto 50 years old, thou shalt number them, everyone that entereth into the service. In the margin, you'll see warfare, to do the work of the tabernacle of the congregation. And then in the second half of the chapter, they're all mentioned again. And in verse 35, verse 39, verse 43, it repeats it again, and this word comes up again, this word service, service, service. It really means warfare, okay? And the total number of the Levites is given at 8,580 in the Levitical army. So they did have to enter the army. But it was an army of a different kind. But it was still one that required the same military discipline as the regular army. the same tenacity, the same determination that regular soldiers would display on a battlefield was going to be needed to fight the daily battles of running the tabernacle. That's what we're being told. And whereas the regular army might fight battles lasting maybe a day or two, the battle with Amalek was on one day, wasn't it? And then, of course, it was only at sporadic intervals. It wasn't, guaranteed that you'd be fighting a battle every week if you were in the regular army. The Levites' work in the tabernacle was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when everyone else had the Sabbath off as a day of rest, you worked twice as hard as any other day. You just picture that scene, brothers and sisters, working in the tabernacle. You can only do that if you have discipline. One thing that every army the world over establishes first in its soldiers is discipline. It's a major part of entering into the army. Without discipline, you don't have a real army, and you have very little hope of success. And this was absolutely true for the Levites too, and for any wanting to follow the Levites' example like we are. Discipline and routine are essentials when fighting the battles of the truth. Now, I've just got a few slides. I came across an excerpt of an individual who described the purpose for military discipline. Okay, I'm just going to read through, and you can follow through on the screen as well. This is what happens and why when a young man enters the army and he has to go through those grueling drills to instill discipline into them. A US Army veteran by the name of Michael Anthony wrote the extracts that I've going to quote here. When a person joins the military, his first taste of discipline is external. His drill sergeants assume that he has no self-discipline and thus seeks to instill it. Left to his own devices, the soldier, sailor, or airman would be slovenly and too self-absorbed to succeed. So I've got to change that attitude. All right? Some of the parents here might recognize a little bit of that. Okay, so a boot camp idea might help out. Hey, well, had the new recruit chosen another life, college or a civilian job, his time away from the classroom or the shop would have been his own. He could have decided on his own when to get up, when to study, and what to do after hours. No one would have spoken to him about the shine on his shoes and the length of his hair. This is not to say that the young civilian would not find discipline in his life. He would also be growing as a person and realizing that he must please his boss or his teacher if he ever wants to succeed. However, his path to maturity can be slower. The military man has gone into a demanding profession. His country depends on him for his very survival. He is going to be asked to risk or give his life for his fellow soldiers and for the nation. He has to grow up fast and be ready to do things that lesser men cannot. So his first days in the military aren't pleasant ones. Discipline must be ground into him. He has to gain physical strength, endurance, knowledge, and spirit quickly. Day by day, morning and night, he is pushed to do more than he thinks he can. He is forced to stand tall, look sharp. He must run everywhere, never give an excuse for failure. At first, he is forced to do these things. He's watched, he's yelled at, he's punished for every infraction. Bit by bit, though, he starts to internalize the code of the military. He starts to take care of his fellow soldiers, whether they succeed or not. He starts to care about the military code. He stands tall, not because someone's told him to, but because of the pride inside him. He's fit, he's ready for the hard life ahead of him. This determination and spirit does not leave the soldier when he leaves the military. He approaches tasks in the civilian world with the same self-discipline that he acquired years back as a nervous young recruit. Now he's confident as an individual, ready to tackle the projects that those around him fear are impossible. He knows, first of all, the value of organization. He can put things into perspective. He sees that the impossible project is only a series of little tasks. He learned long ago that self-discipline is the first step towards leadership. And now he is ready to step to the front of the group and assign those tasks to others. I thought that was really good to just sum up what it means to be part of an army and have that military discipline ground into you. All right, so there's just a summary of that extract of what military discipline does to the young person that joins the army or the Navy or the Air Force. But you can see how this same approach of military self-discipline was going to be needed for the Levites in the tabernacle service. It was grueling work, and it was discipline that was needed day in, day out, 24/7, as we say. Now, whereabouts in the camp did the Levites camp? Of course, we looked at the arrangement of the camp. You had the tabernacle in the middle, and then you had the 12 tribes around the outside. But of course, that doesn't include the Levites yet. We'll come back to chapter 1 of Numbers. Look at verse 52. Here's the Levites. This is where they camped. And the children of Israel shall pitch their tents, every man by his own camp, and every man by his own standard throughout their hosts. But the Levites shall pitch round about the tabernacle of testimony, that there be no wrath upon the congregation of the children of Israel, and the Levites shall keep the charge of the tabernacle of the testimony. So the Levites, in verse 53, were to pitch around the tabernacle. You see, they didn't have their own standard. They didn't have, like the rest of the tribes, a big military banner that had Levites written on it. Why is that? Well, I'm going to suggest it's because Yahweh was their banner. Yahweh was written on their banner, and they had to be as close to the tabernacle as possible. What does it mean to have Yahweh's name on your banner? Let's just skip forward a little bit to Psalm 20. I think there's a lovely little description here of what it means to have Yahweh's name on your banner. This little psalm finds David's army in distress. And the background to the story would seem that they're sort of being cut off by a pincer movement by the nations around at the time. And in this psalm, where the army's in distress, the army are the ones who are speaking in verse 5. Okay, it's in the plural in verse 5. We will rejoice in thy salvation, and in the name of our God we will set up our banners. Yahweh, fulfill all thy petitions. That word banners is the Hebrew word degel, a large military banner. Well, here they are. This is the army. This is the whole army. This is all of David's army. And although they were from all the tribes that had their own banners when they were at home, when they went out to fight, they became like Levites, and they marched under a banner with only Yahweh's name on it. Have a look at verse 7. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of Yahweh our God. How did they remember the name of Yahweh their God? Well, because it was written on the banner. The banner was there to remind them who they were fighting for, under whose banner they were fighting. And so in verse 8, they are brought down. That's the enemies. They are fallen, but we are risen. We stand upright. This banner that they're marching under causes them to stand tall and to march forward. This is an advancing army, moving forward with confidence, their military banner flying above them with Yahweh's name on it. So just notice the parallelism between verse 5 and verse 7. Verse 5 has, in the name of our God, we will set up our banners. In verse 7, we will remember the name of Yahweh our God. You can see how the parallelism matches, except for when we come to the phrase banners and remember. So it's telling you that the reason for the banner was so that you could remember. And that was really the Levites' work, to help the army remember Yahweh on that banner. So the banner was there to help them to remember. The parallelism continued there in verse 7 and verse 8. Verse 7, some trust in horses and in chariots, and they're brought down. But those who remember the name of Yahweh, they're the ones who stand up. You see the parallelism that's being presented here. So if you've got Yahweh's name on your banner, you're tall, you can march forward. If you don't have Yahweh's name on your banner, you're brought down, you're made to fall. So who taught David's army to do that, to remember Yahweh's name and to put it on their banner? Well, of course, it was the Levites. So you can see how influential they were to the regular army's success. The regular army's success depended on the Levites being a success. And so in that sense, the Levites were soldiers too, fighting the battles of the truth with the right weapons and the right motive. And that really is the same for us in the truth today, brothers and sisters, because life in the truth is about learning to be a soldier that's equipped to fight the most important battles you will ever fight, the daily battles against sin, because that's what we have to fight. Sin. And it's an ongoing, continual battle. It's actually a protracted war, day in, day out, from Sunday to Saturday. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's every waking moment is this battle against sin for every one of us. Just a little point to, we won't sidetrack onto this, but this word remember, in Psalm 20, the Hebrew word zakar means to mark so as to be recognized and hence to remember. So you write something down, you make a mark, you record something, and that's how you remember it. And just an interesting aside, the very first recorder mentioned in the scriptures, the one that wrote things down so that others would remember, was a Levite. It's quite remarkable in 1 Chronicles 16, verse 4. The Levite's job was to write these things down and to record, to help Israel to remember. And I think the first one goes on, it talks about Shemaiah, a Levite who David chose to write these things down. Well, how do you fight sin then? What's the technique? How did the Levites do that? Because we have to arm ourselves in very much the same way as they did if we hope to succeed in this battle, in this role, this Levitical army. Well, it was a number of things that they did. Come back to Numbers chapter 1 again. Really, Numbers is the place we're going to keep coming back to time and time again and pick up threads of themes on the Levites and then run through the scriptures and then come back to Numbers and find out more about this wonderful group, this wonderful tribe. So in Numbers 1 and verse 50, we read, "But thou shalt appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of testimony and over all the vessels thereof and over all the things that belong to it. They shall bear the tabernacle and all the vessels thereof, and they shall minister unto it, and shall camp round about the tabernacle. So they were responsible for the tabernacle. It's pretty clear. Okay, they had to bear the tabernacle, they had to minister in the tabernacle, they had to camp around the tabernacle. There's no avoiding it, is it? It was all about the tabernacle. So here's point number one about the Levites and how they prepared themselves in the battle against sin. They were to get as close to God as possible. Isn't that what that's saying? They had to get as close to God as possible. God was to be the center of their lives. God was to be involved in every thought, in every decision, in every action, in every reaction. Bear the tabernacle, minister in the tabernacle, and camp right next to the tabernacle. And then in verse 53, we read this earlier, but in the second half of verse 53, and the Levites shall keep the charge of the tabernacle of testimony. This word keep, the Hebrew word shema, means to guard or protect. That's a military term, isn't it? That's the idea of someone that's a soldier, to guard, to protect, to stand tall. And the word charge, the Hebrew word mishmereth, means to watch, to have the duty of or the custody of. That's a military term. That's a soldier's term as well. So these terminologies are fitting for the regular army and are also used for the Levitical army. So this is their jobs. And of course, we know in chapter 3 that their job in particular, in regards to their duties, was to pull the tabernacle down and to set it up again. So they had everything to do with the tabernacle. But there's more to it than that. If you come over to Numbers 18, it's expanded upon a little bit here in regards to the tabernacle, because Numbers 18, so there's Numbers 3, all the work that the Gershonites, the Kohathites, and the Merarites did with the tabernacle. But here in Numbers 18, we find in verse 3 that it says, and they shall keep thy charge and the charge of all the tabernacle. Only they shall not come nigh to the vessels of the sanctuary and to the altar, that neither they nor ye also die. And in verse 4, and they shall be joined unto thee, and keep the charge of the tabernacle of the congregation for all the service of the tabernacle. I just want you to notice that word all, okay? So it's not just the pulling down and the setting up again. All the service of the tabernacle was the Levites' responsibility. So what are we talking about here? It's not just the setting up and the packing up, but it's all the workings of the sanctuary. What did it take to make that sanctuary work, the tabernacle work? Well, someone had to fetch the water. Someone had to help the priests. Someone had to help the offerers. Everything had to be washed and kept clean. This was the job of the Levites. All the tabernacle. Pretty menial task. Pretty tough being a Levite, day in, day out. And then in verse 5 it says, and ye shall keep the charge of the sanctuary and the charge of the altar. Well, what does that mean? Well, the altar, this is the place where the continual burnt offering was offered, and to have a continual burnt offering meant someone had to go and collect the wood. Someone had to make sure that that fire kept going day in, day out, 24/7. It was never, ever, ever allowed to go out. Now, you're in the wilderness. You're in a desert, and your job is to find the wood. You've got to go and collect the wood to make sure that the continual burnt offering never, ever went out. It's not easy, is it, doing that? All this type of work, the menial task. It's a struggle to maintain enthusiasm and a positive spirit. This is hard, tedious work. It would be so easy to give up, sit back, take it easy. But that's not the option of a soldier. A soldier battles on with determination, sword always at the ready. And so the Levite had to keep focused on the work at hand, and remind himself that this work was as important, if not more important, as the soldiers in the regular army. Think you could have kept up in the tabernacle? Eh? I'm sure some of the sisters could put their hands up and say, yes, I could. What about us, brethren? You know, it's tough work, constant. You need discipline, need self-discipline. It was teaching you, brothers and sisters, about maintaining your discipline in these menial tasks, because that's the application that you can use in spiritual things. And to do those spiritual things regularly. So what does the New Testament say about soldiering? Actually, there's quite a lot. We're not going to turn these up. You may like to just jot them down. I'm sure you'll know all of these places, but here I've just lumped them together. Soldiering in the New Testament. It's amazing. There's a lot. And it's all coming from, in many cases, the lives of the Levites. So we know about Ephesians 6. We all know about the spiritual warrior there in that chapter. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 1 to 6, it's the battle of the mind, the pulling down of strongholds. You've got to sort of adapt that siege warfare mentality. Throw everything at sin to pull it down. Don't give it 1 minute's attention. Romans 6, verse 13. We're going to make sure that the instruments, the word instruments is the same idea as what we saw in Genesis 49, where Simeon and Levi were described by Jacob as instruments of cruelty. They had weapons that they used for the wrong reasons. Well, in Romans 6, Paul says the instruments, the weapons that we have to have are weapons of righteousness. Romans 7, Paul says that every waking moment is a battle against sin. The good that I want to do, I don't do, and the bad that I don't want to do, that's what I end up doing, he says. And it's just constant. Wears you down. Every waking moment. But in Timothy, particularly in Timothy, there's a number of references, and all of these, I think, come from the Levitical army, the language of Numbers 1 to Numbers 4. Keep this charge, Timothy. Well, wasn't that what the Levites were told? To keep the charge? To war the warfare? That's straight out of the Levites, isn't it? War a good warfare, says Paul. In chapter 2 of 2 Timothy, he says, be a good soldier. That means stay focused. Don't get distracted. I charge thee, he says. His final words in one of his final epistles is, I charge thee, Timothy. Keep active in the truth. Keep preaching, exhorting, rebuking. You just make sure you maintain that charge. I've given it to you. And then, of course, his final words, I have fought a good fight, he says. It's up to you now, Timothy. You've got to fight a good fight too. Don't make a mistake. It's a fight, Timothy. Don't treat it like a holiday. It's a daily battle. That's the New Testament's take on what we've just seen in Numbers chapter 4 with the Levites. So that's soldiering from a Levite's perspective. But there's actually more to it than just being a soldier. Because although we've seen them as, soldiers in respect to the battles that they would face in doing the tabernacle duties, the question still remains, would they ever need to pick up a real sword and use it? I'm talking about the Levites now, not the regular army. Would they really need to pick up a real sword? Well, there is another reason that's given for the Levites to be soldiers around the tabernacle. And I just want to follow that for the next few moments. Because if we come back to Numbers now, Numbers chapter 1, again. Told you it would all be coming back to Numbers. It all happens here. Numbers chapter 1. There's this phrase that we read in verse 51. And in verse 53, which I just glossed over, I just want to pick that up now, because you'll notice in verse 51, when the tabernacle setteth forward, the Levites shall take it down, and when the tabernacle is to be pitched, the Levites shall set it up, and the stranger that cometh nigh shall be put to death. Who did that? Why would they do that? Have a look at verse 53. But the Levites shall pitch around the tabernacle of testimony, that there be no wrath upon the congregation of the children of Israel. Why would there be wrath on the children of Israel if they came close to the tabernacle? Well, just a couple more quotes on this same theme found. Have a look at Numbers chapter 8, verse 19. I've coloured these in, actually, because it's a theme about the Levites. You'll see at the end there, at verse 19, that there be no plague among the children of Israel when the children of Israel come nigh unto the sanctuary. So there was the threat of a plague being unleashed on Israel if they came close to the tabernacle. And chapter 18 of Numbers and verse 22, we see, neither must the children of Israel henceforth come nigh to the tabernacle of the congregation, lest they bear their sin and die. So what's this saying? There's a number of passages there telling us that the Levites were the ones who would stop Yahweh's wrath from coming upon the nation through plague. By stopping people coming into the tabernacle, their job was to put up a wall and say, you can't come any closer, sorry. By stopping, and if necessary, killing any who came near and were not allowed in the tabernacle precincts, whatever the reason might be. They were the protectors of God's holiness. They were the gatekeepers. That was their role. They were the gatekeepers to the tabernacle. So not only did they work in the tabernacle doing all the menial tasks, they were also responsible for being gatekeepers with real swords by their sides. They guarded the doors, checking all that entered in. And if someone tried to enter in that shouldn't, they had the authority of God to manhandle them away or even kill them in order to stop God from sending a plague. This is very important work, isn't it? There's no wimps here in this role. This aspect of the work of the Levites developed into an even more significant role in the time of David. Let's skip across now. Let's come across to 1 Chronicles chapter 23. David saw the importance of this role. 1 Chronicles 23. David is recorded here numbering the Levites and organizing the Levites into their various roles, their various courses. I've sort of simplified it here on this chart, on the PowerPoint, because verse 3 to 6, we're told how he assigns the 38,000 Levites that he had at his disposal to use as he prepared for the building of the temple that Solomon would build and the organizing of the temple. 38,000 Levites, quite a lot, isn't it? There was 38,000 in total to do the work. Of those 38,000, if you look at verse 5, 4,000 were porters. This word porter means a gatekeeper. In other words, there's 1,000 porters on each side of the temple. 1,000 have been assigned to guard that side of the temple. It's still to be built, all right, but David's organizing this and getting it ready. That's a lot, isn't it? You think it's really that important that you needed 1,000 on each side? Okay, they had their roster and their rota. Okay, and you'd come up for a week and then you'd go home, and then in 3 months' time you'd come up again, and your job was to be there for the week protecting the temple. All the doors were protected by you if you were one of those porters. Now, 4,000. Some of you may have done this before, but chapter 23 through to chapter 26 shows all of those divisions and how it works. You'll see chapter 24 is the division of the priests. Chapter 25 is a division of the singers. So it's chapter 26 we want to go to and see the way in which David selected and ordered the porters. And in chapter 26, half the chapter is given over to the porters, and the second half is given over to the officers and the judges. And we're going to see that on Sunday morning. But here's the porters, the division of the porters. See in verse 1, concerning the divisions of the porters. I just noticed this in Gill's commentary, his exposition of the whole Bible. He just said this, or doorkeepers. And he explains what that was, whose business it was to open and shut the doors of the temple, to keep all impure and improper persons from entering into it, or any of the vessels being carried out from it, and to prevent tumults and riots about it. So that's your job as one of the gatekeepers. All right, you were to stop impure people from entering in, and you were to stop the valuable vessels from being stolen and taken out. And any riots or tumults, your job was to quell them. And so you had the authority to manhandle or kill those that were causing that. It's a pretty important job. So notice who they were. Verse 1, of the Korites. Verse 1 to 9 are Korites. Then in verse 10, it says, also Hosah of the children of Merari. So 2 verses about those from Merari and 9 verses of those from the Korites. So there were 75 porters who were in charge of the 4,000 that came from the Korites, and there were 18 who came from Merari who were in charge of conducting the 4,000. So that made a total of 93. I want you to notice that the greater number came from the line of Korah. Now, that's not insignificant. That is extremely important. Remember the Korites? Remember the family of Korah? Okay? These are those that did not stand with their father Korah when he defiantly stood in the door of his own tent. Remember, Korah stood there and Moses and Aaron had said, to come to the tabernacle and said, nope, we're not. We're standing here. Okay, you remember that scene? Just picture that scene. Put yourself back there into that scene. There was Dathan, all right, standing in the front of his own tent, defiant and arrogant. And with him were all his children and his wife standing in the door of his tent. And there's Abiram standing in the door of his own tent. And there's all his children and his wife and all his stuff. And there's Korah standing in the door of his own tent. He's defiant, he's arrogant, and he's completely alone. I've never seen anything like it, brothers and sisters. And on that day, the sons of Korah made a bold, clear statement that we would remain faithful to Yahweh's house, Yahweh's tent, whatever the costs. So here they are, years later, still faithfully protecting Yahweh's house. Now, you just take a look at them. You might want to colour some of these phrases in. Have a look at verse 6. Also unto Shemaiah his son were sons born that ruled throughout the house of their father, for they were mighty men of valour. Verse 7. The sons of Shemaiah, Othni, Raphael, Obed, Elzabad, whose brethren were strong men. Verse 8, all these of the sons of Obed-Edom, they and their sons and their brethren, able men for strength for the service. Verse 9, and Meshelemiah had sons and brethren, strong men. You didn't mess with these fellas. They were strong, brothers and sisters. Feel that? Able men for strength. These were physically tough, built for the task. They had built a discipline, a regime to make sure that they could tackle those that came with a wrong motive. They were strong. But I'm going to suggest it's not just physical strength. They had strength of character. And it was that strength of character that caused them to remain true to their God. They were strong spiritually as much as they were strong physically. They followed their forefathers, the first in the lines of the sons of Korah. We want to be like them. We don't want to change. They were noted for being dependable when things were crashing down around them. They were strong in the face of immense pressure, and they wouldn't be moved. Even when Dad had set up a new tabernacle, they were absolutely dependable, were these Korahites. And God said, that's the type of people I need to guard my temple, my tabernacle, guard its doors, guard its furniture, protect my holiness, and in so doing, protect the ecclesia. People that don't wilt under the hot sun of trials, but soldier on. Feel you could do that task, brethren? You see, this is not a task to look at and think, oh, it's just menial service in the tabernacle. The Levites' role was important to protecting Yahweh's holiness. And so these were the men that David made chiefs over all the porters, 93 in total, as we said, responsible for all the temple gates and all the treasure in the treasure house as well. 24 positions that needed filling 24/7. So I've just got a picture of the temple that Solomon would build. And you can see there, brothers and sisters, that David designed it in mind with gates everywhere. Every side you could come in. The tabernacle only had the front entrance. David had a vision of anyone being able to come from any direction. And so all of those positions had to be filled. You can see that there were 6 on the east side. There were 4 on the south side. There were 2 on the west side on the first gate, 4 on the west side on the second gate, and 4 on the north gate. And then there was the treasure house, where all the tenth was brought up so that the Levites could have, plus all the vessels and the treasures of the house of God stored in there. There were 2 guards at the front, 2 guards at the back. That's a lot of soldiers, isn't it? And you're one of those porters, and your job was to be there, standing guard 24/7 for that week. They had a rota, as we said, but you had to stand there, rain, shine, snow, hail. Your job was to protect. It was hard work, staying focused, staying alert, remembering the reason that you were there, never letting your guard down. And the reason that you were willing to do that was because you loved that temple. You loved Yahweh. You loved his banner. You loved his holiness. How much do you have a love for God's house, brothers and sisters? A love that would enable you to be relied on to stand guard as a doorkeeper. Particularly in this age where there's so many exciting things that you could be doing rather than just standing there tediously guarding and watching over the things of Yahweh. You need someone, brothers and sisters, like the psalmist of Psalm 84. Just come to Psalm 84. I think you can probably picture why we've chosen Psalm 84 for this particular study. Psalm 84, the writer of this psalm is a son of Korah. Don't know his name, but what we do know is that he loves God's house, not solely in an academic or a ritualistic sense, but because he knows that's where Yahweh can be found. That's where Yahweh's character can be seen, and it makes him happy. You would have noticed as we read through, the word blessed keeps coming up. The word blessed means happy, and it's the way the psalm is split up. Happy are those that dwell in Yahweh's house. Happy are those who journey to Yahweh's house. Happy are those who build their life on Yahweh. The 3 segments in that psalm. It makes him happy. Does it make you happy to be involved in God's house? Not just to be here, but as you're journeying here? You're happy that you're coming here? So much so that in verse 10, the psalmist here says that to be on the outside, on just the edge of God's house as a doorkeeper, is far more pleasurable and enjoyable and rewarding than having the best position inside the tents of wickedness. All right. So the box seat at the AFL Grand Final, okay, inside that house, because that's really a picture of them collecting together. This psalmist is saying, I'd rather be just on the outside edge, just on the very edge of God's house as a doorkeeper, than be right in the center box seat of the tents of wickedness, because tents are temporary. And so these sons of Korah became the doorkeepers of Yahweh's house. We haven't time to look at this. You may like to go to 2 Chronicles 23. There's a fantastic story of what it meant to be a protector of God's holiness when the story of the removal of Athaliah takes place. And she's removed from the temple. She's taken outside and killed. Who does that? Well, the regular army are involved, but so are the Levites. The two of them work in conjunction together. The Levites were instrumental in that as the keepers of the doors. And they executed that daring plan to remove the unclean person out of God's house. And so, of course, we know that time passes on, and they eventually went into captivity for 70 years, at the end of which some 42,000 returned out of Babylon, out of captivity. And we pick up the story by coming back to 1 Chronicles 9. Sounds a bit odd to have been in 1 Chronicles 23 and 26 in David's time, but now in 1 Chronicles 9, it suggests that the chronicler, of course, is writing this from a position of hindsight. So 1 Chronicles chapter 9, written by the chronicler, possibly I would suggest Ezra, and is obviously about the return from Babylon. Have a look at verse 1. So all Israel were reckoned by genealogies, and behold, they were written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah, who were carried away to Babylon for their transgressions. So here they are, they're coming back. Who returned? Well, have a look at how the chronicler records the return from captivity. In verse 3 to 9, he says, the children of Israel came back. Doesn't say too much about them. He just says the children of Israel came back, gives a few names. Then he says, in verse 10 to 13, he records the priests that come back. And then in verse 14 to 34, just note the proportion that he's done here. All the children of Israel are in verse 3 to 9, that much, just there. The priests are in verse 10 to 13, that much just there. But the Levites get the biggest section in verse 14 to 34. And the way he breaks up the Levites, he talks about the porters, he talks about other work that they would do, and then he talks about the singers. So, this is how Ezra's mind's thinking here. He's got a job in mind. He wants to try and rally up Levites. There's a job to do back down in Jerusalem. How do you do that? Well, you focus on their work. So of all that returned, the greatest attention given by the chronicler here is dedicated to the Levites. And of all the Levites, the greatest attention is given to the porters. So let's have a look at verse 17 to 29. All right. I've just put headings next to each of these little sections here. You may not get a chance to copy them all down now, get the PowerPoint later, and just break up the chapter. It's fairly easy. In verse 17 to 18, you get the names of the porters. In verse 19 to 21, you get the history of the porters. You might like to put that in parentheses or brackets, okay, because it's sort of taking you back in history. In verse 22, you get the qualities of the porters. And in verse 23 to 29, you get the work of the porters. We want to just really focus in on verse 22. Have a look at verse 22, brothers and sisters. All these which were chosen to be porters in the gates were 212. So that's how many have come back, 212. Remember, there were 4,000 in David's day. Now there's only 212. These were reckoned by their genealogy in their villages, whom David and Samuel the seer did ordain in their set office. Now, this is a little bit difficult to understand what's being said here without knowing the meaning of some of these words. Because the word ordain and set office, I think, give a really good picture of why these people were trusted. The word ordain means to appoint or to establish. So they're given a position. It's not just, I'm choosing you. This is an actual position. Okay, they've been appointed to this position. What's the position? Well, the word set office, you'll notice that in the margin, it means, or it says, trust. This word set office means to be trustworthy, dependable, to be faithful. So what it's really saying, I think it's probably better to maybe right next to verse 22, that the reason that these people were chosen, that they were appointed, was because they could be trusted. Okay, so they were reckoned by their genealogies in their villages, whom David and Samuel did appoint because they could be trusted. That's what it's saying. The NIV says the gatekeepers had been assigned to their positions of trust by David and Solomon and Samuel the seer. So that phrase, positions of trust. The ESV says David and Samuel the seer established them in their office of trust. Okay, so it wasn't necessarily an office of being a porter. It was an office of being trusted, an office of trust. You were dependable to be able to protect Yahweh's holiness. That's why you were chosen. You were reliable. Now, when we read about David and the 24 courses of the porters that he set up, this verse is saying that it was really a work already started by Samuel. He started it. And he passed it on to David. Why Samuel? Why Samuel mentioned here, starting this role of porters? Well, of course, Samuel, of all people in the Bible, he came to learn the importance of opening up the tabernacle doors. That was his job as a little boy. 1 Samuel 3, verse 15. And Samuel was instrumental in restoring credibility back into the future temple, tabernacle, in the future temple to come, after the debauched mess of Eli's sons had made of the tabernacle. And to do this, Samuel knew that he required men he could depend on, men he could trust. And he found those men, mostly from his own family, actually, as a son of Korah. That's where Samuel comes from. That's his lineage. And so he inspires them. And he was able to utilize them to great effect. And so here's David. He comes along a little bit later, and he finds no reason to change these men. They're still reliable. They're men that can be trusted, even with the most precious items of treasure. And years have passed now. And now it's after the captivity, and they're still reliable. Absolutely dependable. That's these porters that are being recorded here in this section. What a lesson, isn't it, brothers and sisters? You need to colour that verse in. If you want to be a spiritual Levite now and in the future, you need to be dependable in the truth. And I can tell you right now, brothers and sisters, that many in the brotherhood are dropping like flies. Especially when it comes to, things like theistic evolution and such like. Can your ecclesia depend on you to keep those things out? Are you reliable, trustworthy, dependable, keeping worldly, humanistic things out of God's house? You know, that's what Jude talks about, doesn't he? The very message of Jude is to stop those who are coming in the back door. He says, contend earnestly for the faith, for some have crept in unawares. They've come in through the back doors. You've guarded the front door, but what about the back? How dependable are you as a gatekeeper to your ecclesia, to your family, to God's house in this part of his earth? Well, if we had to choose a standout example of all the porters and gatekeepers from the annals of history, who would you choose? You know, there's one man that stands taller than all the others. Such was the example of this man that he became the mentor and the inspiration for all who followed after him. And he's mentioned back in the history section of verse 19 to verse 21 in 1 Chronicles chapter 9. Because in relating that history, Ezra mentioned something that we didn't find out by reading Numbers. Because at some point, probably after Korah's rebellion in Numbers 16, the sons of Korah took on a role of being the keepers of the gates of the tabernacle, keepers of the entry. And they did this willingly. They said, we don't want someone like our father ever coming into Yahweh's presence again, so we'll watch the tabernacle doors. You just leave that job to us. We'll take care of it. And it was, by and large, the sons of Korah who continued to do that throughout every generation. That's an incredible responsibility and legacy of the Korahites. So have a look at verse 19. And Shalom the son of Korah, the son of Ebiasaph, the son of Korah, and his brethren of the house of his father, the Korahites, were over the work of the service, keepers of the gates of the tabernacle, and their fathers, being over the host of Yahweh, were keepers of the entry. Now, next to verse 19, you need to probably write that this is recording the events of Numbers 16. Remember the we referred to it earlier? Korah, Dathan, and Abiram standing in the court in the door of their individual tents is recorded in Numbers 16. And from that moment onwards, the family of Korah, the children of Korah, said, we don't want to be a part of Dad. We want to make sure that we don't have that problem ever again. Leave the job of being a doorkeeper to us. So next to verse 19 is Numbers 16. Now that happened really early on in the wilderness wanderings. But then verse 20 says, and Phineas, the son of Eleazar, was ruler over them in time past, and Yahweh was with him. And when did that happen? Well, next to verse 20, you need to write that this is referring to Numbers 25. Now, Numbers 25 happened in the 40th year. So there's a gap of about 35 years or so between verse 19 and verse 20. But it says in verse 20 that Phineas, the son of Eleazar, was ruler over them in times past. This word ruler is the Hebrew word nagid, from which we get nagad. It means a commander, and it's a term used of a military leader. Okay, a commander as occupying the front, someone willing to lead, like someone in the army. Well, the question remains, when did Phineas become their commander? Some make the suggestion that when the children of Korah stood apart from their dad, that Phineas took them under his wing and brought them up. But if you go and look at the sort of ages we're talking about, brothers and sisters, the ages of Korah's sons and of Phineas make that impossible. Because Moses and Korah were about the same age, about 80 years old. The sons of Korah would be then what? 50 years old, maybe? Between 40 and 60, let's say. Okay? The son of Moses was Gershon, and the son of Aaron was Eleazar. So the sons of Korah were the same age as the sons of Moses and the sons of Aaron. Phineas was the grandson of Aaron. So at that moment, he's probably under 20 years old. They're much older than him. He didn't come along and take them under his wing and say, all right, I'll take this little group of Korah's children and bring them up. Not like that at all. You see, there was a moment that occurred in Phineas's life which cemented forever the relationship that existed between Phineas and the sons of Korah. And it took place right in front of the tabernacle, right in front of the door of the tabernacle. And forever after that, Phineas became the leader, the military commander of anyone who would be a doorkeeper. He became the mentor and inspiration to every son of Korah ever afterwards. You want to be a doorkeeper, son? Then let me tell you about Phineas. So let's come back finally to Numbers 25 and just finish on this story, the greatest story about a doorkeeper found in the scriptures. We find in verse 6 of Numbers 25, and behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So a man of Israel with this Midianitish floozy on his arm dares to walk straight past the door of the tabernacle. This is the center of the camp. And in verse 7, Phineas is horrified. And he thinks immediately of Yahweh's holy character, and he can't stand what's happening. And he picks up a javelin, and without compromise, he goes and stops the man and woman stone cold in their act of immorality. Verse 7, and when Phineas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, you see, he's 3 generations below Aaron, he rose up from the congregation and took a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. And so the plague was stayed. Right next to that, Numbers 8, verse 19. You see, gatekeepers could stop plagues. Here's a gatekeeper stopping the plague. This was his job. He used the javelin. He had that weapon for that purpose. And in verse 9, 24,000 died. But thanks to Phineas, it could have been as much as 50,000. Like the days of the men of Beth Shemesh when they opened up the ark. 50,000 died on that occasion. But what I want you to notice, brothers and sisters, was who was it that he killed? Have a look at verse 14. Now the name of the Israelite that was slain, even that was slain with the Midianitish woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu, a prince of a chief house among the Simeonites. Isn't that astonishing? We've come a full circle. This was a prince from the tribe of Simeon. And we started in Genesis 34 in our first study last night, where Simeon and Levi had a little ecclesial of their own, full of violence and deceit. They were as close as 2 brothers could be. And here we have Phineas of the tribe of Levi thrusting a spear through a prince of Simeon. And for this action, God gave Phineas a blessing. Back in verse 12. Wherefore say, behold, I give unto him my covenant of peace. His life as a soldier would ultimately result in everlasting peace. You know, we talk about peacekeeping soldiers from the UN, don't they? They don't keep peace, do they? You know, what war has the UN actually ever stopped? And of course, Afghanistan is a testament to that. 20 years have passed by and it's back exactly as it was. Peacekeeping troops. This is quite different. Here's a soldier whose work will eventually end up with the result of everlasting peace. And he'd be allowed to retire from the army. The battle will be over. Verse 13, and he shall have it, and his seed after him, even the covenant of an everlasting priesthood. Why? Because he was zealous for his God as a gatekeeper, as a porter, and made an atonement for the children of Israel. This is what's been promised to Phineas, an everlasting priesthood. We know that this is, of course, the order of Melchizedek. But it's going to consist of individuals who act exactly like Phineas, the gatekeeper. So what have we learnt, brothers and sisters? I hope we've learnt some things about soldiering in the truth. We've learnt that true Levites are soldiers who camp close to God. The battle is long and hard, but it's our duty to fight it. To be a good soldier, you need daily discipline, which includes to regularly read the word, to pray, to work faithfully with our hands and help others. Our military banner is to have Yahweh's name on it. We must fly up high to help us remember him. And what about a gatekeeper? What have we learnt about gatekeeping? A porter. To be a gatekeeper is to protect God's holiness as an individual, in your families, and in your ecclesials. It required men of strength, physically, yes, but also in character and resolve, men of trust, men who were reliable and dependable. We should ache to be in Yahweh's house and love all that is associated with it. As part of the temple of God, we need to keep things that are unclean out of our lives, no matter how much the agony and the struggle, and to keep it out of our families and ecclesias too. It's quite a task, brothers and sisters, and the battle is still going on. We need to keep battling until Christ returns. So let's go to Malachi 3 and just see what have we learnt out of Malachi 3 that is applied to our studies for this afternoon. These words here, written straight out of the Levitical code in Malachi chapter 3. I've got just a couple. What was the whole purpose of that banner? That banner was to cause them to remember. Remember. So in Malachi 3, it says, "Then they that feared Yahweh spake often one to another." They remembered Yahweh's name regularly, because you can't talk about something unless you remember what it is you're talking about. They remembered Yahweh's name because they were flying their flag high with his name on it. Can people see the flag over you that it says, "I have Yahweh as my banner"? And then it says, "Yahweh hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared him and that thought upon his name." Yahweh is a rememberer too. Yahweh has our name written in his chronicles. If we remember him, he's promised that he will remember us. And then, guarding the treasures of God's house, he says this in verse 17, "And they shall be mine, saith Yahweh of hosts, in that day, when I make up my jewels, my treasures that belong in my house. And I will spare them as a man spareth his own son that serveth him." Are you a jewel in God's house? You've got to protect that. Do you see your brothers and sisters as jewels in God's house? You've got to protect that holiness around them. So, brothers and sisters, as we wait for the one who has the key of David, that openeth and no man shutteth, and shutteth and no man openeth, as we wait for him to come, who's opened the door for us and is inviting us to walk into God's house, may it be that we put these things into practice in our lives now as we await for him to return.